Imagine walking down a major European avenue. No sound of commerce, no diverse voices, only dead silence. Snow falls on towering, oppressive fascist banners. In this timeline, the future was canceled before you were even born. To get here, history pivoted on a razor's edge in 1940. In our reality, the British Royal Air Force held the line. In this world, the Luftwaffe broke them. That single failure paved the way for Operation Sealion, a successful land invasion of the British Isles that placed the nation in shackles. With British resistance crushed, the German war machine focused entirely on the Soviet Union. Utilizing massive industrial resources stripped from newly conquered territories, an endless column of panzer tanks swept eastward. This mechanized advance completely overwhelmed Soviet defenses. Military conquests solidified into permanent political control. The Reich installed puppet governments to rule over the conquered populations. In Britain, Oswald Mosley was elevated to enforce Berlin's will and silence any remaining domestic opposition. This geopolitical collapse achieved exactly what Winston Churchill feared. The globe was brutally carved up, plunging humanity into a global dark age of absolute, centralized control. Under this victorious empire, the regime's most horrific policies expanded globally. Millions of Jewish people, the Romani, and political dissidents were systematically hunted down. Those who survived the initial purges were funneled into grueling physical labor, worked to death to feed an ever-expanding war machine. Daily life operated under constant psychological terror. Books by religious scholars, minority authors, and dissenting thinkers were burned to erase the vibrancy of human culture. The Gestapo surveillance was so absolute that children were actively encouraged to report their own parents to the state. This flowchart illustrates how the regime weaponized medical science. Research dollars were poured into horrific human experiments and strict population control. The state implemented rigid genetic filtering to engineer a mathematically precise master race. Human choice was completely removed from reproduction. Government officials meticulously selected and arranged marriages between young citizens, executing a cold, multi-generational obsession with distilling the optimal Aryan bloodline. On paper, this totalitarian machine appeared invincible, yet its extreme cruelty guaranteed an equal reaction. In the darkest corners of this occupied world, a desperate human resistance began to ignite. Far from the silent, manicured cities of Europe, a shadow war rages deep inside the freezing Ural Mountains. Here, surviving bands of Soviet guerrilla fighters launch a desperate campaign against the occupying forces. Their daily reality is a brutal test of endurance. Fighting in sub-zero temperatures and facing constant starvation, these guerrillas rely on unmarked, sanitized supply drops, secretly smuggled in from the few remaining neutral nations. Surviving this existence requires a profound psychological evolution. Hardened former communists who once strictly rejected religion increasingly turn to newfound faith. Prayer becomes a vital tool to hold on to their humanity amidst constant bloodshed. Combat operations are highly targeted and incredibly dangerous. A surgical strike to derail a Nazi supply train might succeed in disrupting logistics, but it almost always comes with devastating, immediate casualties among their own small ranks. These freezing fighters represent human endurance in its rawest form. They choose the extreme hardship of the mountains and the high probability of death over submitting to totalitarian erasure. Across the Atlantic, the United States stands alone. The isolated nation finds itself locked in an intense ideological Cold War against a heavily armed Third Reich. But the Nazis don't necessarily need a cross-ocean invasion to defeat America. The country faces an insidious threat from within. High-profile isolationists and powerful industrialists like Henry Ford capitalize on the economic desperation of the Great Depression to foster fascist sympathies and white supremacy domestically. To survive, the U.S. engages in a tense technological proxy war. The space race becomes a critical defense strategy. The American government recruits captured German scientists to build long-range rockets, forced into this moral compromise by the constant threat of Nazi orbital nuclear weapons. Watching the horrifying reality of Nazi eugenics play out in Europe holds a mirror up to American society. The United States is forced to confront its own systemic racial inequalities and segregation policies. To legitimately lead the free world, the government and the people accelerate the civil rights movement. Dismantling domestic racism becomes a crucial ideological counterattack against the Nazi doctrine of forced purity. A free, diverse democracy carries a momentum that no regime built on forced purity can ever hope to match. Despite its terrifying military might and advanced technology, the Thousand-Year Reich is structurally rotten at its core. This visualization shows how totalitarianism operates as a closed loop. By suppressing diverse inputs and crushing natural human creativity, the system breeds immense internal pressure. It generates a systemic paranoia that constantly requires the violent invention of new enemies just to sustain its own momentum. No societal structure can remain standing when its foundations are built entirely on fear, forced genetic purity, and the violent suppression of its own citizens. The Reich's ultimate downfall is guaranteed.